Are you ready, kids?
Hello, it's Employee a Million, and welcome back to SpongeComs. Today we've got Season 1, Episode 20, the finale of Season 1, Hooky, and Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 2, both of which originally aired on April 8th, 2000. And the thing about these episodes is that they spell an end and a beginning for SpongeBob. The end of the episodes produced in the 20th century, mostly, and the end of the cell animation, and the end of the beginning, but also the beginning of SpongeBob as a huge franchise. So let's get right into them. Hooky was written by Sherm Cohen, Vincent Waller, and Meriwether Williams. Don't worry, this is not one of those times where I'm going to forget that Sherm Cohen had been around since Naughty Nautical Neighbors and say, I wonder if Sherm Cohen, this was his first one, because I know for sure now. I do research. And I actually never knew about the term playing hooky or doing hooky growing up. Mostly because I didn't skip school that much unless I was sick. Because it is a term to describe skipping school. And I think that its implementation into a plot about fishing is pretty funny. I like how they liken playing hooky or skipping work or school to going out into the town and just doing something that you're not supposed to. Something very deadly in this case, which is why sometimes I think about this as an allegory for not being around shady people, taking the old seaweed. But that's the thing about this episode, is that it shows what Bikini Bottom, and by proxy the rest of this world's underwater life, thinks about fishing. People coming up from the heavens to fish down and kill people, essentially. And I think that it also foreshadows the SpongeBob movie and this fear of the surface world, because it's still in live action. It's still alien to them, even though they never really go up there. And I think that a lot of this stuff is very good at, like, parodying real life attitudes towards what your kids might be doing on their own that you don't want them to do. As you can see with SpongeBob and Patrick going to this quote-unquote carnival of fish hooks. And another thing about this episode that struck me upon my rewatch is that there's a lot of mixed media in this episode. Of course, most of it is animated. There is some digital animation here and there. Not a lot, but it's very unnoticeable, but it happens like when SpongeBob sees the hook dangling in front of him, first grabs his claw and then an actual hook. You can tell that was done on a computer. And there's also some, like, live action, stop motion, I guess, on the surface world, and just some general live action recordings. So they were broadening their horizons. There wasn't an episode up to this point that had used that many styles and techniques, and I applaud Hooky for weaving them into this story. But I don't just like SpongeBob for its messages. I like it because it has great characters that do hilarious things, and this episode in particular is pretty hilarious. I like SpongeBob's arc of learning not to do things that Mr. Krabs tells him not to. I like Patrick just being an example of what not to do. A total lampwick, as I would say. And I do really like its implementation of peer pressure, because that's another thing this episode is about. Patrick is a pear-shaped pear, if you will, and he's pressuring SpongeBob into doing this. It's because, gosh, it is really hard to describe when you see it so often on the show, especially around the season 6 period. But SpongeBob being dumb enough or naive enough, childlike enough to listen to Patrick leads into some pretty cool mayhem, like in this case. And I think that this is the second time we see Squidward behind the grill. The first is in Pickles. Still not a very good cook. Still burning shakes like he used to. And of course we get more of Mr. Krabs around here, because when you first see him, you think he's a bit nuts. There's these hooks around and he's acting like it's the end of the world. But now SpongeBob and Patrick's lives are in danger, and now Mr. Krabs is really worried. I do really miss authority figure Mr. Krabs, because it's not that they never use him in these sorts of stories anymore, but it was very clear that after SpongeBob's dad became a more established character, like he was already always a tertiary character, but they had a plan for him. I feel like after SpongeBob's dad became a little more prominent in the books, Mr. Krabs' role as SpongeBob's life mentor boss sort of weeded out, and he just became a bit of a money grubber. And I think that this is one of the best portrayals of Mr. Krabs because of that, because he has his greedy tendencies. He does deceive SpongeBob at the end, but at the same time, he does really care about SpongeBob, even if his methods of showing them does turn into fear-mongering at points. But dads do that, mums do that, parents do that. If you don't have a mum or dad or parent, authority figures do that. And something about this sort of idea, it reminds me of the drop-off in Finding Nemo. I wonder if they got influence from this episode, because it's also about getting closer and closer to the surface world, and then eventually one of them does get caught. But in that case, it's the impetus for the plot, and here it's just a joke at the end. And the most I remember about this bit that honestly is a bit padding, Mr. Krabs getting SpongeBob and Patrick to the Sailor's Promise, is the clip of the Jimmy Neutron interruption where they turn into puppets. That is really funny. I know a lot of people were really scared of that when it happened, and I think it happened again one April Fool's Day, but I think it's funny. I'm sure that Hooky and Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 2 were reran many times over the years, so one or two interruptions isn't too bad, honestly. The other thing, there are a few callbacks to Help Wanted. Patrick, at the start, his first line in the episode is "Good morning, Krusty Crew" again. He falls down there, and SpongeBob does go to work chanting that he's ready, ready, ready. And there's a Help Wanted sign that Mr. Krabs hangs up onto the door when he's quote-unquote certain that SpongeBob's done for. And I think that's very smart to do, because this is... if season 2 hadn't been picked up, and 3 and 4 and 5 and all those, this could have been one of the last times we see SpongeBob. So I guess putting some threat, some bookend to show that something about the show is going full circle, I like that. I mean, of course, we have one more season 1 episode after this, but hey, for now, this is SpongeBob's biggest threat. And honestly, for the most part, I think that this is a very honest ending. Because even though it's about a fish hook, about fishing, and about SpongeBob being dragged up to the heavens, and it's about girls giggling at a guy getting naked for them, at the end of the day, it is circling around a very earnest conversation that SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs are having, with SpongeBob coming out about his addiction, him getting hooked. You can see why I thought it was about seaweed. And Mr. Krabs is kind of like a dad to him in this regard. But I can understand if you think it's a bit, like, mean on SpongeBob, but he did deserve it. He did disobey Mr. Krabs. And I don't know if getting Pearl and her friends to see SpongeBob in the nude was part of Mr. Krabs' devilish plan, because this is all part of a plan. I don't know if that was a part of it, but it does sort of add to SpongeBob's karma. And sure, SpongeBob can get a bit of karma, sure. But overall, I think that this is a pretty good episode. I wouldn't call it one of my absolute favorite season 1 episodes, but it's somewhere in the top 10. I do really like that for a more message heavy episode, they do still have a lot of fun with it. They do still link it to the underwater world and have some cartoony gags to go along with it. They have all sorts of roles for the characters to play. Squidward is mostly in the background, and Pearl is kind of a plot device, but Mr. Krabs, SpongeBob, and Patrick are in character, and they're also very entertaining, and all go through some sort of journey. Even Mr. Krabs, who is sort of just teaching SpongeBob a lesson. And again, not every SpongeBob episode has to have a message, but it's great when they do. And this is one of the good ones. But about the boy being nude for girls thing, I can see people having a bit of an issue with this aspect to the ending, but I think it's more like a toddler running around nude and teenage girls laughing at that. I don't think it's about guy anatomy is funny, because of course SpongeBob doesn't have guy anatomy. If anything, he probably has girl anatomy. But it's a whole other can of worms, and there's a can of tuna. Don't know why it was shipped back to Patrick's house, but sure. Good ending to a very good episode. And at last, we have Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 2, written by Chuck Klein, Jay Linder, and Mr. Lawrence. Mr. Dr. Professor Lawrence, sorry. The very last episode of Season 1 of SpongeBob. And I like it, but it does kind of get lost in the mix when you think about it. When you think back on Season 1, you think of pizza delivery, you think of fun, you think of sleepy time, you even think of the first Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, but you don't really think about the second one, and it's the very last episode. It's the last impression you get of Season 1, if you're watching it in order. And for the most part, as far as we know, Season 1 did air in order. Wonder why that is. Because this episode does have some very strong elements to it. Its original name was 25 Words or Less. Originally, they weren't going to go with the Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy number at the end, naming convention that they would do for the next couple seasons. Instead, it was probably going to be more about the contest that SpongeBob went and entered. And that is a very prominent set piece for the first act, but it isn't the main point of the episode. The point is to show SpongeBob being a fan. And of course, this is a big part of it. SpongeBob making these statues out of Krabby Patties. Originally, it was going to be patty meat. There is some art of the patty meat Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy statues floating around on the internet. There was a cell painted of it. But eventually they just went for the patties against a casting couch background without the couch. Sorry for having my mind in the gutter a bit. But yeah, must have been a very elaborate contest if that was the winner. I wonder if anyone else ever made patty structures. And I wonder if there could be more SpongeBob episodes about contests where they have all these different things. Of course, there's surf and turf, but you know what I mean, TV contests, because Nickelodeon did a lot of them back in the day. I'm sure they still do sometimes, but back around the time this episode aired, it was like every month. And I do like that the thing that SpongeBob gets is the conch shell, all hail the magic conch and all. And it seems to be a parody of the bat signal because every time it's blown, and I don't know if it was ever good or if it's just worn out over time, there's just a to it. Not as bad as the rock bottom language, but you know what I mean. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy come to the rescue of whoever's blown it. And it was part of the show. And that's another thing that this episode does well. It adds to the world of Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy. It adds to their show. It adds to their rogues gallery. It adds to their gimmicks, the invisible boatmobile. Because I'm sure one or two superheroes had an invisible car, and they're sort of parodying how ridiculous that would look here. And of course, the late Ernest Borgnine and Tim Conway are as great as ever in the roles of Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy. They're fantastic throughout this. Even if they don't make the most of their roles like they do in some of the later ones. But I think this is the heaviest usage of them ever. Like it is the episode that is the most about them and their relationship to SpongeBob as a fan. And that's the thing, SpongeBob, for the most of this episode, is sort of like an annoying fan. But that isn't the worst thing ever. They do get some great jokes out of it, and they do get a conflict out of it that drives the episode. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy have to deal with SpongeBob being this sort of follower. I think a modern term of it is a stan, stalker fan. Don't know if that term was around when this episode aired. But a lot of this stuff is very funny. Like, I do like SpongeBob running Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy ragged with all their requests. Because we get the tried and true SpongeBob getting more annoying montage now. And it's fine. It's funny. And I think that SpongeBob's characterization here is a little more annoying than in most of Season 1. It ain't Sandy's rocket, but it is something. But again, conflict has to happen. And again, SpongeBob is supposed to be showing how superheroes and, in general, TV stars would deal with fans of this nature. This is also explored again in I'm Your Biggest Fanatic, which I think I like about the same as this episode. I gave both of them a 7 out of 10 back in the day, but I don't know which one I ranked above the other. Can someone help me out with that? If you want to read my old reviews? If you are forced to read my old reviews? Oh, and of course I do really like that Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy have opposing viewpoints of SpongeBob being a fan of this nature. Mermaid Man really wants to help people out, and he really wants to give the little guy a chance at being raised with good superheroes, while Barnacle Boy is, for the most part, an old man and just wants time by himself. But something that is a bit odd to me is that we see a picture of baby Barnacle Boy underneath the surface. Like, he has the old nose that he does now. And I think that breaches the continuity that they established later in Mermaid Man Begins. Of course, this is much earlier, so it's not like this is retconning a Season 8 episode. But still. And I think that's the most memed part of this episode, Barnacle Boy's sulfur ray. And I wouldn't call this the funniest episode, but that ain't the funniest joke to me. If anything, the funniest part to me is the very end with the dirty bubble. And even then, that's not, like, a great exit point for the episode, in my opinion. But then we get to the meat of this episode. Like, there are two main courses of this episode. first part was the vegetables that you eat first to get them out of the way. Then there's the meat, which is Mermaid Man completely fulfilling SpongeBob's dreams as a superhero. And again, I'm probably bad at commentaries, something I've learned throughout all this. I have no idea where the Batman smells thing came from. I remember it was in the first Simpsons episode, but I don't know if that's the origin of it. That would be something. The Simpsons Season 1 premiere and the SpongeBob Season 1 finale having the same thing, the same music, song being parodied. And I do really like the stuff that they show Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy doing as superheroes that SpongeBob messes up. And I really like this very small appearance from the Atomic Flounder. And this is his only ever appearance, and he's played by Carlos Alazraqui. He's a pretty prominent voice actor. He did Spyro before Tom Kenny took over. He did Mr. Crocker in The Fairly Odd Parents. He did Rocco in Rocco's Modern Life. But he isn't a very prominent voice actor on SpongeBob, and this is probably his most famous role in the show, honestly. Oh, and of course, another running gag in this episode is Barnacle Boy getting burnt. Not just on the Invisible Boatmobile's engine, but also from the Atomic Flounder's atomic breath. But another voice actor, bit of trivia. The Dirty Bubble is played by a guy called Charles Nelson Riley. I don't know who that is. Maybe he worked with Ernest and Tim on some other 60s sitcom. But I don't know. Oh, and a jukebox. I don't see those around anymore. But then again, I don't go to that many rundown diners. I think this is the first appearance of the diner that we see again in Chocolate with Nuts and Missing Identity. That's in season 3, and this is season 1. The tail end of season 1. And what are my final thoughts on season 1 after talking over all its episodes? I still really enjoy this season. I think that it was a very fresh, very inventive, very funny, very original, very heartwarming introduction to this world that America and the rest of the world still can't get enough of. And there are plenty of great episodes in it. There's Ripped Pants, Plankton, Pizza Delivery, Opposite Day, Fun, Employee of the Month for the second bit, Scaredy Pants, SB129, Karate Choppers, Sleepy Time, The Paper, Rock Bottom, Texas, and Hooky. And I love all of these episodes, and they all came from this first season. And I think for all the stuff that hasn't really carried on into the rest of the show, there's definitely some stuff in this season that is worth remembering. 20 years on, and if it ever comes to this, 50 years on, I do really love me some SpongeBob, and this got a lot of people into it and made it as popular as it is, and I could not have it any other way. That is why my question of the week for you this week is, what's your favorite season 1 moment? Favorite episode is probably going to be very easy, Pizza Delivery. But I just want to know your favorite season 1 moment, because not everything is set in stone for like the best possible instant in season 1. There are a lot of different great jokes, great scenes, great character interactions, great starts, great middles, great endings, and I want to hear what you guys have to say about it. Some answers for last week's question. Do you prefer adventure or slice of life episodes? Super Seal, Amazing Coconut, and Jack McGinn prefer adventure episodes, and Michael Eurizmia prefers slice of life. And with that, I bid you adieu until October. Goodbye for now.
More SpongeBob coming up. Stay damp.